unmet patient needs in that analysis. And we're also having Russell, who's going to explain us what they did in ERN Eye to review the ontologies, the offer codes and HPOs. So Russell's is a rather technical one. So I've asked him to spend a little bit of time explaining the relevance and what it's all about. They will have 40 minutes. By the way, we also selected a good practice presented by Dorica, but she's in the airport, so we will have her presentation in April, and the call that we're going to have in April. So Ilaria and Charissa are going to have 40 minutes, and Russell 40 minutes. I've asked them to just organize the time as they wish. In principle, it would be 20 minutes of presentation, 20 minutes for questions. Now, the objective of this good practice is that you all understand what they have done, how they've done it, and to be able to replicate it in your own ePAG, or understand what you need to do to replicate it. We'll see how this one goes, but we were thinking about maybe transforming these calls into webinars. So for April, it might be a webinar, and we might reach out to the wider 255 patient advocates. And we will be recording this one. So just for your information, this call is going to be recorded so that we can then share more broadly. So Charissa and Ilaria, you're first. Do you have the slides? You can share the screen. You know how this goes?
I have the slides ready, so I thought I would start sharing, and then maybe if Ilaria also puts it on her screen, I will stop sharing, and then Ilaria will put it up so that we can control our own slides.
Okay.
Is that a good idea, Ilaria?
Yes, good idea.
And we will, Lenya and me, we will be looking into the chat. So in principle, I would ask you to please make the questions, speak up and just, do the questions that you have rather than using the chat. But, we will be, in any case, Lenya and me will be monitoring the chat. Go ahead.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
Let me first start sharing. Where is
When you have 10 minutes left, I will let you know, okay?
Yeah. Oops. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Okay, as Ines had already introduced ourselves, I'm Charissa, and Ilaria and I will do a presentation. We originally, we did this together with another ePAG of ours, Ana Fiera, and we also sent it forward to the rest of the other ePAG advocate members in our ePAG. We are from Reconnect, the ERN, and that is the connective tissue disorders and musculoskeletal diseases. Now, to give you a background, we did our good practices based on the patient involvement in identifying unmet needs on clinical patient guidelines. The duration of the project took about 4 to 6 months. It was a publication of state-of-the-art on clinical practice guidelines, and it was, I'll give you a background. Originally in the Reconnect steering committee, there was a discussion, and it was decided that we would publish a narrative review of existing clinical practice guidelines, or CPGs in short. And also, I will explain this later, perform a state-of-the-art CPGs per disease group. During this same meeting, there was a proposal made by the ePAG advocates in the steering committee to identify the unmet needs in each disease. The clinicians had further decided that we as patients were allowed to draft the papers and specifically write the patient's unmet needs of each disease. Later in the year, and some papers are still going to be published, but almost all of them have been published in the BMJ RMD, that's the rheumatological papers, open. To give you a background of our ERN Reconnect so that you can follow us a little bit further on, we have 3 pillars in Reconnect, or 3 arms, as we say. The rare connective tissue disorders, which are the systemic sclerosis. MCTD is for mixed connective tissue disorders. Idiopathic inflammatory myopathies. APL, or antiphospholipid syndrome. UCTD, unconnected connective tissue disorders. IgG4 related diseases, and that is an autoimmune immunoglobulin G type disease, and relapsing polychondritis. These are all rare diseases. The second arm are complex connective tissue disorders. Some of these diseases are in some countries considered rare, in other less rare, or just complex, but they are included. And the systemic lupus erythematosus, or we just say lupus, and Sjogren's syndrome. And then in the third arm, we have hereditary connective tissue disorders, where the Ehlers-Danlos disorders fall under. Our ePAG structure is, we have 1 representative per disease, a representative per pillar. For rare, complex, and hereditary will also represent the whole pillar, and these representatives will also be members, or were allowed, or are part of the steering committee. Then we also have to manage the whole ePAG, 1 senior and 1 junior coordinator. And then as well, we have 1 member and 1 alternate participating in the steering committee from the ePAG. So this is our ePAG. So you can see some of the faces. You can see Ilaria, who will also, she represents systemic sclerosis. We have Vera Guimarães. We have 2 new ePAGs, Eve and Sander, who did not participate in this project as they are just new. Sander just joined last week and Eve this week, and we have not even finalized everything. Lisa Matthews, just like Vera, she was part of the project to help identify patient representatives for the disease. But for others, as undifferentiated connective tissue disorders and IgG4, we have yet today to find somebody to represent. Then also we have Ellen Cornet for lupus, and Ana Vieira. She could not be here because she is following a course in Portugal. She is also the representative for Sjogren. Now, only with the hereditary connective tissue disorders, Jürgen and myself are representatives. There are 2 here. There are more than, there's actually 14 types of EDS. 1 is represented in another ERN, and there's 13 represented in this ERN. And we really need 2 patients advocates. And for the steering committee members, I'm the patient coordinator for EDS, and I'm also the steering committee members. Anna represents the complex connective tissue disorders, and Ilaria the rare connective tissue disorders. Jürgen and Ilaria are the senior and junior coordinators who manage the whole ePAG. Now, the situation before when the whole project started. The purpose was that that CPGs, or the clinical practice guidelines, would be identified. And the problem was that only 4 of the 10 diseases had previous CPGs, which were systemic lupus, the inflammatory myopathies, systemic sclerosis, and Sjogren's syndrome. The other 6 conditions, they did not have any existing CPGs and or recommendations. So each of these working groups, the clinicians and the ePAGs, had to review these as well, look in publications, see if there was anything available, and make recommendations. This would also be a first. Now, why a first? And what do we mean with a first? In the rare connective tissue disorders, there were no papers ever been published before. That included any unmet need and taking patient perspectives into account. So, and also originally clinicians were the ones in charge of performing the literature review and drafting the papers. So this holds a whole new situation also for a lot of the members of the ERN. The ePAGs, as I said before, were asked to be involved, but in the steering committee, the advocates, we were a little bit also involved in the reviewing the whole process and to represent the patient representatives' perspective, as it may be beneficial to include patients' unmet needs in the papers. When we said this, we asked this question during the steering committee, and to our surprise, the coordinator and all the members of the steering committee agreed, and they went a step further. They said, well, you should not only be involved, we find that you must also identify and draft a patient unmet needs on the CPGs and co-author the papers as well. So every patient advocate in our ePAG would have the chance to co-author. So then the ePAGs in the steering committee, we were asked to also review the patient's contributions, and we were recognized as co-authors in all the other papers. So there was not an ePAG patient advocate for all the diseases, and that would cause a problem, and we were asked to find a patient representative. And for the diseases where we did not find one on time, the unmet needs sections were actually developed by either Ilaria, myself, or Anna. And the clinicians never had any experience, or most of them in the ERN had any experience to work with patients on this level. So it created a whole new situation where we had to all learn from. Well, as I already mentioned, but we wrote it down twice, that it's very important to know that a lot of the diseases did not have any pre-existing documentation. And now I ask Ilaria if she would take over.
Yes.
Ilaria,
Ilaria,
you have 10 minutes to, if you have 10 minutes if you want to do 20 and 20 questions, 20 presentation, just for you.
Okay.
You can go a little bit further, it's okay.
I will go quickly through the contribution to patient engagement and improvement of care. Here is where we really started working. We had to collect the unmet needs of our communities. So we had to collect 10 diseases, unmet needs. And
would you like me to share the slides for you?
I am sharing, you can't see? Can't you see?
No, we can see.
Now I can see.
Okay, now?
Yeah, now it's coming.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
So, perfect. So we had to search in our communities all over Europe and then select the unmet needs of patients for the 10 diseases. And it was very hard, as Charissa said, and it was also very interesting because when I compare an unmet need of a patient with systemic sclerosis living in Cyprus and the unmet needs of patients living in Norway, wow, there was a great difference. I knew I would find a difference, but it was a really, really a big gap. So we understood in that moment that ERNs were the place to be. And we needed to raise the level of the Cyprus patients to the level of the Norwegian patients. So we tried to select the most important unmet needs of the communities. And then we had to discuss them with our senior and junior disease coordinators, I mean the clinicians. And what came out were transversal unmet needs that are common in all the 10 diseases. And we decided to start working from those transversal unmet needs. So we brought the unmet needs first to higher standards of care, and then decided to identify at least 3-4 unmet needs and start working from them. We started working on the therapeutic education because among the clinicians in Reconnect, we have experts in patient educational therapies. And at the beginning, it was not that easy. We had some argues with the clinicians, but then went really, really well. We deliver a survey on the patient education. We, as ePAG, spammed it all over Europe through our channels, website, newsletters, and social media. And then we already have the results. We asked the clinicians to provide us the results in order to translate them once again in all national language and get back to the patient that provided their answers to the survey, because these are 2 unmet needs in one. So the therapeutic education and get back with result to the community of patients. And then we will start working on the certification of websites that provide right and scientific information, like EURORDIS website is a certified website. And we also believe that patients need to know what we have done, and we need them to know what happened in ERNs. So we decided to work on lay versions of the narrative reviews. So let me just have you an idea of our creators. We are very, very proud of them. You see, systemic sclerosis is my disease. So this is the state of the art of clinical practice guidelines for systemic sclerosis. You see highlight the names of the ePAGs that reviewed the papers. So Charissa and Anna and me, of course, and I worked on the patient unmet needs. Each of us decided with their respective disease coordinators how to work on the unmet needs, because it's part of a global project. And I decided that I wanted to the unmet needs that already had a publication, because I wanted scientific community not to say, okay, these are the unmet needs of patients, they always complain themselves, they are always unhappy. No, I wanted them to know that those unmet needs were already somewhere in PubMed. I made my review, literature review, and they have references. So now these unmet needs must be satisfied. Okay, this is Sjogren's syndrome. Anna worked on it. We also have lupus, antiphospholipid. So for lupus, Alain worked on it. For antiphospholipid, we helped the patient in working at. And EDS has a different story. So I would like Charissa to take again the
reins.
Yes, and spend
yes.
a few words on it.
As I previously also mentioned, there were a whole bunch of conditions or diseases that had no existing state-of-the-art or clinical practice guidelines. So we had a slightly different task, and Jürgen and I, we approached, it was very much focused on the patient unmet needs. And as one of the unmet needs is that there is no clinical practice guidelines or any patient pathways or anything available at all. So Jürgen and I, we approached also our patient community and or a wider patient community, and then we presented with this paper. And it was for us a very important part, because there are actually no doctors that can follow us up, and it was also very important that this was published in RMD Open, because a lot of patients, there are no physicians, specialists, or clinicians or geneticists available, and we also had to involve the rheumatic community to start helping our patients in all of Europe.
Okay.
Ilaria?
Yes. So now I go through the what led us to the success. First, we started having a strategic vision, but for long-term impact, because we wanted to deliver something that will give the results through the year in the delivery of care, of course. And we have to explain to clinicians that they would benefit by networking with patients, because, as Charissa mentioned before, it was the first time that the patient's views on unmet need were included in such documents. Not the first time that unmet needs, but the patient view on them, which is quite different because we brought our perspective. And honestly, for some of them was the first time of such a collaboration, but we have a very good and sensitive ERN coordinator. Maybe because of her experience, she works in lupus with pregnant women, so she's very aware that involving patients from the beginning can make the difference. So she pushed with us to make her colleagues understand that such an involvement were crucial. And working very hard on the same targets led us, ePAGs and clinicians, to have a mutual respect. And this was the cornerstone that made everything easier after that. We realized how patients with rare conditions, or maybe with very rare condition, need to be trained in advocacy problems like EURORDIS does, but also EULAR, which is the European Society of Rheumatologists. It's our society, which has a very strong representation of patient, which is PARE. They should work a little bit more for patients with a rare condition instead of just rheumatic diseases. And here what we have learned. We learned that an active participation led us to fully represent our communities. We engaged with them, we gave them feedback, and we were really bringing their voice into Reconnect, and was not only our perspective and our voice. And this, what I said, the cornerstone, the mutual respect, allow us to be also not only active, but proactive, to propose, to say, hey, we would like to do this, we would like to do that. And they were hearing, they were listening to us, and they were ready to work, to engage with us. And it's also happened because we try always to be as diplomatic as possible and in a professional way. The communication is not among patients and clinicians, but among ePAGs and clinicians. Also inside the Reconnect steering committee, we are at the same level. And this is quite important because we must act like professionists. So it was very difficult. It was not easy to work at the guidelines, to make the review, and we learn a lot. So I am very grateful to this experience. And we think that focusing the attention on the unmet needs and on the patient views on the unmet needs made them be acknowledged by the scientific community and made the clinicians happy because now they have some publications more in PubMed, and we are happy because we have our views in PubMed. So we are all happy now. And it is also the proof that the involvement of patients from the beginning can make the difference for us and from them. But we also have to face a challenge, which is, as Charissa mentioned, the disease that were not covered. we were very happy to contact single patients with those diseases and try to collect their unmet needs. Some of them really didn't know what they were expected to give, what we were asking, really. And this is the reason that make us say, please improve the training, the advocacy for those patients, because we need their voices, because they are, the less they are, the higher voice they should have. But anyway, I think that there is also a bias, because despite the fact that we put all our enthusiasm, we can't know what living with those conditions mean. So I think there is a little bias. But anyway.
Shall we open now the floor for questions?
I have another.
Okay, go ahead.
This is the proof of concept. So we now are happy to replicate the experience. And we met 1 month ago in Pisa for our annual meeting. And the clinicians were talking about working on patient pathways. And they were very happy. And we rose our hands and say, hello, we are working on, we have a working group in EURORDIS led by Matt Johnson on clinical pathways, patient pathways. Other ePAGs in other ERN already did and shared their good practice. So maybe we can work together. And they say, no, start working you. We need your inputs. So it's useful if you provide us the results of your pathways before we start working on it. And I think that without 1 year of collaboration, we would not have that answer. Stop. Go on with the questions.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you, Ilaria. Any questions for them?
Yeah, can I just say, I don't know if anyone else is trying to jump in. First of all, I'd like to thank you for, I think, was actually a fantastic presentation. Not just the presentation, but the topic. And I'm actually scratching my head and thinking we should really have had the whole call this time for this particular topic, because actually I think what you've done is fantastic. I would like to repeat that in our own network, and there is so much more that I want to know than is possible to present in this short presentation. So I hope that you get the chance to represent this again in Bucharest, because it deserves a much wider audience than you can get in this. And really, bravo, I really enjoyed the presentation, and it's exciting to think about what you've achieved. And I feel a little inadequate coming up next that I have to follow that.
Well, thank you. I do have to also recognize that within our ERN, they are very open to patient participations, and we get a lot of opportunities. And we are very happy to be part in the Reconnect. At first, it seemed like everything was going so slow for us, and then all of a now it's going so fast there, and we are really we had to show them what our worth was, but we have become really equal partners in our ERN. So thank you for the compliment, Russell.
There was someone else who wanted to ask a question.
Just quickly, Alain here. I'd just like to make a comment. I was part of the exercise being in the same ERN, but what I would like to stress, and that's of relevance for I think the other ERNs, is that one of the opportunities we have through an exercise like this one is actually we had patient unmet needs in PubMed. Now, it's not the publication. Well, it is, but it's not only that. It's the fact that when people do a research later, that's where they go. And that means that those unmet needs, they're not published once, they are published multiple times, because people go back to PubMed to make research, and they're going to find those comments time and time again. And I think that, frankly, that's one of the priorities that we can achieve through working in the RN, is to have some patient views included in articles that get in articles that are going to be on PubMed in such a way that they get retrieved later on. And that's something that's of high value, and it's worth all the efforts which have been done for getting that results through.
Thanks a lot.
I'd actually like to sort of follow on from that. I'd be really interested, and I don't know whether this is something that perhaps we'd speak at another time, but I'm really interested in how you documented in PubMed those patient unmet needs, sort of, you know, the type of approach that you took and what kind of documents you came up with, or was it just that those views became part of those state-of-the-art guidelines? But I agree it's really important, so I'd like to understand more about how you documented that.
I also, following up on that, I have another question for you too. How Ilaria was mentioning that there were very different unmet needs varying from country to country. So how did you come to an agreement on what to keep, kind of, or what was the standard?
Okay, they were quite different because of the regions. We tried to keep the unmet needs that were shared by most of the countries, of course.
And with EDS, what I did was we mentioned that there were also cultural differences or differences in country to country, as there was no care or anything existing in those countries. So I approached it on a more general way. To be clear, the unmet needs sections are completely written by the patients. So in the EDS part, the unmet needs sections is like almost 2/3 of the paper. So it's very important that we were recognized, and also that we had the chance to write it as well. And they did not interfere, and the only changes that were made were maybe grammatical or some spelling, but we had completely the free hand to do it.
If I can just complement that, because I think that the way unmet needs were identified varied a lot depending on what was existing by the various pathologies. And so in some cases, at least if I can, the example of lupus, we could rely on existing patient panels which were conducted by organizations where people had voiced what their needs were. So we could use those panels, which did not have the credibility of an external publication, but when put together, were getting there. And then we got that reviewed by an equivalent to a CAB, a community advisory board. And I think community advisory boards are a great source for understanding unmet needs and for giving them the credibility they need. They went through the board of Lupus Europe to validate also there. And then finally, we confronted them with doctors and we said, listen, this is what we see as being the unmet needs. Now, if you think of the patients you have in front of you, does that make sense? And it was amazing to see that everyone came back and says, yes, it does make sense. I can recognize what people tell to the nurse when they arrive. I can recognize what they say to the social workers when they arrive. I can recognize the need. And so all these small items, none of which in itself was sufficient to call it an official unmet need, when put together, make it definitely pass the cut. And now it has the credibility associated with it.
Yeah, and we wanted to keep separate the clinical unmet needs from the patient unmet needs, because sometimes they were tried to combine, but we want to keep them separate because these are two different fields of action.
Okay. Any other questions, comments?
This is Lisa. I just wanted to say that this is such good work. I'm really, really impressed. And of course, it would be nice to duplicate it. And it would be very good to have sort of a list of first steps, for example, how you did the initial surveys, also that you got a budget for the translations, etc., because that would facilitate it for other ERNs. Since, for example, in my ERN, there is no budget for, for translations. So it's very, very good to just to put this down in writing, how the initial steps were taken, because then it can evolve. But just to show how much support you need initially from the clinicians, the various meetings you had. I suppose you work with Matt also, but that would help because...
So maybe, so we're going to upload the good practices. They have, all of them, they have fill in a template. We're going to upload them to our website, but maybe Charissa and Ilaria, after this call and this suggestion, you might want to go through your template again and maybe include, because maybe include these first initial steps because they're not there. There's some explanation around the situation, the initial situation, but maybe you want to complement it.
Anyway, no money.
And no money.
No money.
But
we
I
did
mean,
the translations without money.
Yes.
Yeah.
We had to be very creative.
I would appreciate that. Yeah, but I mean, still, you know, because it's sort of easier for us then to start up in the same manner, kind of.
Yeah.
So it would be a great help.
If I can give a tip, deepl.com, DEEPL.com. If you, it's a...
Okay, we already use that.
Yeah.
And in in Reconnect, we have not only clinicians, I don't know, maybe also you, but we have methodologists, we have experts in health economy, we have experts in law, in legal issues. So not only clinicians, we are supported for the service by methodologists. Yes, and this is quite important because we don't think, okay, we want to know what the state of the art on something is. No, we have methodologists that say you can say that, ask this one. It's really teamwork.
But then, Charissa, Ilaria, it's good that you add that into your good practice.
Yes,
that, you know,
absolutely.
those you had those resources. You just don't, you know, because you have them, you don't realize how important they are. But just put them there.
Absolutely.
The initial steps. That's good. In the maybe in the initial situation section.
Yeah, with pleasure.
Can I also say, I think first of all, we need to think again a little bit, maybe, Inez, about the template, because actually we're asking them to put lots more stuff in, but of course the template is necessarily a very limited space with a maximum number of words, etc. If we're not careful, the only way to get it in is to put it in as bullet points. So I think we need to have the possibility to link from the template so that people can look at a summary version of the best practice and get a flavor of it. But then for something like this, for me, and from Lisa's comments, I think she perhaps feels the same, I'd like to dig much deeper into this because I want to suck everything I can out of this best practice and develop it for our own network, because this is something that is really needed across all of the networks. And I think this is a perfect example of best practice. For example, it seems that there have been quite a few papers published in different conditions. I'd actually like to read all of them. I know nothing about those conditions, but reading about how they've approached the unmet needs in different conditions helps me to think about how I might make that approach in the conditions where I'm responsible. Now, how do you do that? It's going to have to be some sort of shared space that is linked from, you know, we may need a series of links so that you can dig as deep as you want and however much time you have. But for me, you know, I want to spend hours and hours on this, not just a short amount of time, because I think we need to develop it in our network as a project.
Okay, then maybe you can contract Charissa and Ilaria as consultants. for ERN Eye. No, I listened to what you're saying, Russell, and we can have another.
And also, I mean, as you were saying, Ines, to contract, I think if people have been through a journey like this, if it could be maybe on a couple of instances, maybe that we could maybe probe their minds and ask them questions, you know, so in a way, a sort of short meeting, just where we can really talk so that we don't misunderstand things, because even if we spend hours and hours on all these fascinating documents, we do need the sort of human touch, and you're very good at explaining things, both Ilaria and Teresa. So if we could just have time to ask you things.
We will have them in Bucharest, so you'll have time for questions in Bucharest. Now, Russell, yours.
Yeah, can I quickly add, I think actually this could itself make a publishable paper. It's something you might want to consider, Charissa and Ilaria, that together with your network, you actually publish a paper on the approach, the general approach you took.
It's funny that you mention it. There is a big EURORDIS coming up in Madrid, and I just, because especially the unmet needs for EDS are very, well, they're tremendous, and there are no doctors and there are no centers. And I actually just wrote a abstract with Jürgen's help about this, and also about the unmet needs, and I hope it gets accepted because that will give me a platform to actually go further than these papers. And yesterday evening I had a rare disease network on the Flemish side, which are basing on a couple of proof projects starting up based on the ERNs, where as well EDS is included, and they actually are picking up on our papers, and because we wrote the unmet needs, so it was a very, it's starting to have a really good impact in the community.
Okay, now your turn, Russell. Thank you both. Very good work.
Okay, yeah. How to make me feel inadequate. That was a good way to do it. I think there are some interesting parallels. I don't have any slides, by the way. I wasn't sure whether we would have the facility to share them, but in fact, it's a topic that I'm not sure what I would put with slides. Before getting too much into the practice itself, why do I think it was worth submitting as a best practice? And the answer is that there are two reasons why we submitted our small project, which is the ontology creation. One is because the topic itself of rare disease ontologies, it's of relevance to every ERN. All of us have a need for these. And so if it's not already been undertaken by your network, then there is a strong chance that it may need to be done in the not too distant future. It may already have been done before the ERN was created, of course, because a lot of the ERNs were kind of up and running before they even, the hand isn't a message, is it? Sorry. They're kind of up and running before the networks were even devised. And so some of the networks are in very different stages of readiness when the ERN project took off. But even where it has been done, I think this is actually a live process. Our knowledge and understanding of the diseases that we're representing is changing all the time as new information comes through. And so as that changes, we need to keep revisiting these. In fact, we did our project, it was in, I think, October 2017, we had our major workshop. And I thought that we'd done it, we'd finished the project, and that was all done. But in fact, I then discovered that there were still lots of mistakes, lots of things that came up as we started to implement within the CPMS. And actually we
Russell, sorry to interrupt. Can you explain, go back a little bit and explain?
I'm going to get on to the actual topic.
Because you're talking about the project and we don't really...
Okay, so let me jump around a little, sorry. So there are two reasons. One is that I think this is relevant for the other networks. The other is something that I got very much from the previous presentation, is that the real benefit we got from this is not just the benefit of the outputs of the workshop that we took part in, but it was the sense of collaboration with the rest of the network. And that's something that came very clear from Ilaria and Charissa's presentation, that in working together on a very professional basis with the clinicians within the network, it was a new way of working for most of these people. It was something that they couldn't really envisage in many ways, and it's resulted in a complete different way of viewing ePAG involvement in the network as a result. And from what the previous presentation gave me, I have the feeling that the same has happened in their network from a different project. So what is this project? The project is to create a rare disease ontology for rare eye diseases. And I say create, we didn't create anything, we adapted what was already there. What is an ontology? An ontology in its simplest form can perhaps be described as a dictionary, a set of descriptions for diseases, conditions, or symptoms, so that doctors can actually use the same terms when they're discussing something identical with each other. And it's, at first sight, it seems that, well, it's obvious. If we're talking about a particular disease, everyone is going to know what we're talking about. But actually, different countries, different places, even within the same country, have different ways of describing the same thing. And in fact, there are multiple ontologies already in place. Everyone is using them, and not least when recording information into registries or into hospital health records. So when you're, when the doctors, and forgive me if I'm getting too simple over this, but because it's difficult to know quite how to pitch the explanation, but when the clinicians are encoding the information on the hospital forms, they will tend to use an ontology that has been agreed by the particular hospital. And there are, at last count, I think at least a dozen of these. And we find that even within the UK, for example, lots of hospitals might be using up to 5 or 6 different ontologies when coding for diseases. That means that when they want to share information with each other about whether it be about prevalence or other epidemiological aspects, then actually they don't really know what they're talking about when they're trying to communicate with each other. So it sounds obvious, but we obviously all have to be talking the same language. And we decided at the early stage, I say we, it was decided at the very early stage that we need to settle on 2 different ontologies, 2 different sets of dictionaries that we are going to adopt as the standard for the ERN Eye. We need 2 because the 2 different dictionaries that have been settled on have a different way of looking at things. So we're first of all using the OrphaNet codes and the OrphaNet ontology that I think most of you will have come across, although may not have considered it as an ontology. But they have an ontological record in OrphaNet, so that all of the codings that go through, and you can nest through if you've ever looked at it, every single genotype is actually given a separate code within the OrphaNet collection of disease descriptions. And so when you talk about this particular code in one hospital, if they're using the same system, then they know exactly what condition that you're speaking about. But this is all based on genotype information and on a genetic approach to looking at diseases. But sometimes, in order to facilitate the conversation, then the HCPs need to look at a different way, a phenotype aspect of looking at the disease, which is really more a question of listing diseases by their symptoms or by the impacts that they have on people. And so we used for that the HPO, the human phenotype ontology, which was developed by an American doctor. And that actually lists diseases in a completely different way to the author code listing, but the same things. So we have, in essence, we're using two different languages to describe the same thing. But we need those two languages because we can't satisfactorily take an accurate picture by just using one. Using more than two would make things just too complicated, and in actual fact, most of the other ontologies that are out there and in common use already take one of those two approaches in the first place. And in fact, it's the phenotypic information that tends to be more common. So it's already, and forgive me if with my rather clumsy explanation, because I try and simplify something that is quite complex, and it's not surprising if I trip up a few times on the way. So by all means, if I do make a mistake, somebody jump in and correct me, please do. So it was decided that we needed to clear up this, because actually as soon as the experts within the ERN started to look at the listings that were already in place on HPO and on the OrphaNet, they realized that a lot of the descriptions that were down for the diseases were actually wrong. These have all been written by qualified medical clinicians, but not necessarily by ophthalmologists, and more particularly not by ophthalmologists who are experts in rare diseases. And so this was a piece of work that had been done before, but was done actually to a standard that wasn't robust enough to make it work for the facilitation of virtual clinics, for the building of registries, and all of the other things that we need to do within our network. So the network decided we were going to revisit all of this, and a workshop was convened over 3 days. Actually, it was to be held, or it was held, in a convent on top of a mountain, where essentially they locked everybody in and almost threw the keys away. The food was disgraceful, which is an important aspect for me, but the nearest place even to buy a coffee was about 6 or 7 miles walk down a mountain, and the walk back would have taken about 5 hours. So even I wouldn't go that far for coffee. The original concept was that this was something that would only be by invitation only, and it would only be clinicians. The ERN invited experts not only from Europe and from within the network, but actually from North America and from further afield, so that they wanted to have this as something that could be used beyond ERN Eye, and that would ultimately be accepted by the ophthalmic community worldwide as a definitive source of information on rare eye diseases. But patients were not invited, and it was explained that this is a very complex and a very technical meeting. We really don't think, we understand and we appreciate your desire to be involved, but we really don't think that patients can have anything to contribute to this type of conversation. And that was even accepted by some of my fellow ePAGs, but I was quite adamant. I said, look, if we're going to be partners in this ERN project, we have to be involved in everything as far as possible. I'm not a believer that we must be in absolutely everything, and there's a debate we could have at another meeting sometime as to whether ePAG members should have any access to or involvement in the CPMS system. My personal view is that I draw the line when it comes to patients' private data, and if there is no reason we need to be there, then perhaps we shouldn't be there. But everything else, I'm inclined to believe we should be there, not least because we need to understand what the clinicians are getting up to and how they're operating. So I kicked up a bit of a fuss, and eventually it was reluctantly agreed that 2 ePAG members could join this workshop as well. And we went along. It was not an easy gig by any means. There was a lot of work involved in trying to read up about the existing ontologies and approaches to ontologies, because sure as hell, after kicking up such a fuss about going there, there was no way I wanted to arrive and be thought to be completely ignorant and not actually contributing everything. So it's actually a big a burden actually on the ePAG. It certainly wasn't a fun time. We had a series of workshops that went from 8 o'clock in the morning through till mid to late evening, and for some of the groups, because these tasks had to be split up into different specialities, and I know some of the groups were working till midnight on 2 consecutive evenings, thrashing through all of the documentation. We had a senior representative of Orphanet in attendance, and also the guy who actually founded the human phenotype ontology, HPO ontology, a chap called Peter Robinson. And they were both with us for the 3 days, moving between the different groups in the different rooms, listening in to the debates that were taking place, and offering advice where necessary, and actually, essentially in the case of Orphanet, revising the data set that they had on a laptop while we were sitting with them to make those adjustments. The way that we went about it is that we were sat in committee rooms with disease specializations. And so those people who were in my particular case, I was involved in the working group 2, which is neuro-ophthalmic diseases. And there were about 6 or 7 neuro-ophthalmologists from around the world in the room, sitting, going through the listings from start to finish, deciding what was missing that needed to be there, and actually discussing each and every dictionary term, if I come back to the dictionary analogy. So looking up every word in the dictionary and saying, do we think this is an accurate and up-to-date meaning for this word? Do we think it's fit for purpose? And you would be surprised how many times there was a dispute between the clinicians in the room, and they would turn to the patient involved, in this case me, and say, well, what's your view? And so my role was sometimes there as an adjudicator to give what I felt was the patient's view when there was a disagreement between 2 groups of clinicians on the accurate definition. At all times, it was a constant reminder to the clinicians there when there was a patient in the room that at the end of the day, why are we doing this exercise? We're doing it to try and provide a better service to patients. And so there was a complete removal of ego in the room as a result of that, because, and there is always that temptation otherwise. Sometimes doctors will want their definition to stand because it's a question of their professional reputation. But at all times it was down to us. At times I disagreed with them when they had a decision and we had a debate about it. A few times I got my way forward, many times I didn't. But at all times I would say that the view was listened to carefully, taken seriously. And there was the lead of the neuro-ophthalmic group is a rather abrupt and direct German chap who I'd always been a little bit intimidated by before this meeting. But at the end of the session, he actually said to everyone there how much he'd appreciated the work that we'd put in, how much he was surprised that we hadn't been nipping off to excuse ourselves from such a long, complicated conversation. And it actually transformed the relationship, the human relationships that we've had in the network ever since. before, I think some of the clinicians there thought, we have patients here because we have to tick a box to say we have patients involved. After this workshop, I think they were quite shocked to see that we were prepared to work just as hard as they were, that we took it every bit as seriously as they did, and that we were prepared to shoulder the burden alongside them. So I think for me, I do believe that the output from this workshop was more robust as a result of having patient involvement. But actually the much more important thing for me was the sense of teamship, team spirit and camaraderie that we managed to build by sharing what was a really difficult task and trying to do whatever we could to support it. Peter Robinson, the guy from the HPO ontology, actually commented in his summing up of the meeting that in something like 20 years of attending similar sorts of gatherings, he'd never actually encountered such a collegiate spirit as he had between the physicians there. When he was in a room with the neuro-ophthalmologists, it was, for example, it was a constant aspect of the discussion there. Well, okay, this works for us in neuro-ophthalmology, but this particular disease is also impacting one of the other working groups. What do we think about how it might work for them? And even, in fact, it will be of relevance to other ERNs. So for diseases that cross boundaries, how will this impact the ontology that they might work on in Vascan or another disease group altogether? So it was a hugely successful project, I think, still ongoing. The work, although I'd thought we'd finished and we could just forget about doing any more on this, it continues. But as I say, I think for me, the far and away the most valuable message I believe this is worth passing on is we can be involved in just about every aspect of the work of the ERNs, but it comes with a big caveat. We have to be prepared to work. We have to invest time in understanding the conversation, in contributing properly, and we have to be resolute in our intention to be a full partner in the networks. I believe that ERNs are an absolute game changer in rare diseases, that there is nothing more important for most of us in the coming years, but that the only way they'll achieve a fraction of their potential is by the patients being totally involved as full partners and not as passengers or as token members of the various committees. I'm not sure, I have no idea how I'm doing on time.
No, you're good, doing very good. I was about to tell you you had 20 minutes to go, so we can open the floor.
Yeah, I can talk more, but it's probably better. I'm better with questions than I am with presentations.
I have a couple, but someone has some questions there? Comments?
As far as I heard...
They're all asleep.
No, they're not.
No. As far as I heard in PISA during our meeting, and please Charles and Alain correct me if I'm wrong, I understood that as the ontology is a transversal unmet need of the 24 ERNs, or either call for tender or centralized by the European Commission, there will be something on ontology. It was just mentioned, but we didn't get deeper.
Yeah, I think my read is that if there is a need, it is a transversal one, and therefore the ERN will follow rather than lead, because they already benefit very much from an existing ontology done at the level of EULAR, which can be replicated, and that the key thing is going to be to include Ehlers-Danlos in that, which is currently poorly included, but for the rest, they feel like they already have a lot. But that's where, so they feel like this is not where we have the most value add right now. We don't specifically need that job to be done short term. We will follow the ERN if the ERN decide to do something transversal. That's my read. But yeah.
I understood that was not just for Reconnect, but for all the ERNs.
I think there is I think communications is not a strong subject for the ERN project as a whole. So actually, I'm not aware of the project you're discussing, unless it's something to do with the registry call that is rumored but not appeared yet. In the case of the rare eye disease of ERN Eye, it's unquestionable that I mean, listening in to the clinicians as we went through this, the existing two ontologies that I think are almost certainly the ones that will be adopted by all of the ERNs, by the way. But looking at HPO and Orphanet, or OFA code, the consensus during the workshop was that actually these are not fit for purpose prior to the workshop. That they were all over the place. They were written by people who were clever, medically qualified people, but not people who were working in the field of rare eye diseases. And so it was possible to see why they would have written those descriptions down in the way they did it, but at the same time to completely fundamentally disagree with the way that it had been presented. And it meant that it was not possible to actually use those in their present form. Now, it may be that it's very different in some of the other disease areas, or it may be that the work has been done more recently to a higher standard for whatever reason. Even, for example, in the HPO, then I think Peter Robinson wrote quite a lot of these himself. He's a qualified clinician himself. And in the areas where he's practiced in the past, then obviously one would expect a much higher standard of definition than in those where he hasn't practiced. The work that we've done, it's the approach can be certainly mirrored across different networks, but the actual output, it's for the most part, it's specifically for rare eye diseases, or, and I did mention that we were on many occasions thinking about how it might impact other ERNs if they have a condition that where, for example, a visual, a neuro-ophthalmic condition is a part of that disease. Because, of course, there are a lot of diseases that cross the ERN boundaries.
Thanks for that, Russell. So what this week was it? Yeah, this week Monday there was a kickoff meeting of a new project that's like a spin-off of RD Action. It's called RD Code, but this one is to foster the kind of uptake and implementation of OFA codes at member state level, or in hospitals or regional health authorities. Yeah. So that's we can talk about that at some other point, Russell. Yeah. I might need your help there. I also have a question for Lisa, because when we were at the VASCERN annual meeting last year, you were doing something with the Orphanet, but I think you were reviewing the description of the diseases that it's in Orphanet, right? It's not, you were not doing anything with OFA codes, right? At least in the HHT group, they were doing that.
Yeah, because we were not doing anything with the Orphanet codes. It was in VASCERN, I think with the Orphanet codes, it was VASCA, the other group in VASCERN. They were working with that.
Because maybe I'll reach out to Caroline, and then maybe Russell and Caroline can present together in Bucharest or something. I need to think about that. Thanks. Claudia has a question there in the chat. How many diseases? Can't see. Can you read it, Russell?
Sorry, I did read it a second ago. How many diseases are covered? Well, within ERN Eye, we have 900 rare eye diseases. in the neuro-ophthalmology subgroup, somewhat less than that, but actually probably, I mean, we were 3 days on neuro-ophthalmology alone, and I would guess that out of the 900 plus rare eye diseases in our network, we probably represent less than 50. So I think the point that Claudia is making is that this is a really heavy time commitment, and I completely agree. It's one of the great challenges, I think, which is getting away from the topic of this particular best practice, but how to actually facilitate patient involvement. It's all very well me saying we should be involved in everything, we should be full partners, etc. But of course, many people can't devote the time or don't have the financial resource to follow it, which is really a challenging problem that has yet to be overcome and even begun to be tackled, I think, at EC level.
Agree. Anyone else? Any other questions for Russell? I think what you did is massive, actually.
Well, I don't. It feels quite small, to be honest. And as I'm not just being falsely modest. I'm genuinely feeling in awe of the presentation that came before, and this feels like a much smaller thing by comparison. But again, when I said about the need to have links from the templates for the best practices, in this particular case, we did actually publish a paper that was one of the outputs of this project, and I can happily provide the link to that paper.
Yeah, added there. Ilaria and Teresa did that. They added into the summary box.
Okay.
That will be helpful.
Yeah, I should do that because in and of itself, it doesn't explain this process, but it does perhaps, if you're thinking about should we be looking at this for our ERN, then it does explain a little bit more about the overall process of tackling the ontologies and the ongoing approach, because we have a sales job to some extent as well, we meaning the network rather than the ePAGs, because we want this to be adopted not just by ERN Eye, but around the world. It is crazy. I mean, from a patient perspective, it is crazy that people are using different sets of terminology all over the world. And the sooner we get to a commonly understood and agreed set of terminologies for everybody, the better it will be.
Russell, and you were explaining that Orphanet, there was someone from Orphanet doing changes. So in the end, the output or the outcome of the workshop was kind of resulted in changes in their classification. They did that.
Yeah, well, absolutely, in both. I mean, there were dramatic changes to both sets of ontology, just in this subset, because they have huge mappings of almost every rare disease, not just rare eye diseases. Orphanet, I think they have a policy of updating every 6 months.
Yeah.
Although he was actually updating his master data set while he was sitting in the room with us, it won't have gone live until some months later. Yeah. And it also, of course, has to be validated, and there is a process they have to go through. But this was a wholesale change rather. Normally, I think the process would be that individual clinicians or HCPs would submit suggestions for changes where they think that a definition was either inaccurate or insufficient, and that would be considered by a panel, and it would be changed on an evolutionary basis. This was more revolutionary. This was wholesale change to a big block of the ontology.
Okay. Great. Anyone else?
So I'd like to ask, I think it's really interesting. Within Epicare, I know that some of the professionals have been conducting a review of Orphanet, the codes, I believe, to try and standardise for the various epilepsies. But we have not been engaged at all from an ePAG level would you advocate that we have our AGM in a couple of weeks' time? Would you suggest perhaps we should ask to be involved? What sort of benefit would you suggest that we might get? I totally understand that there was a huge amount of commitment and effort from your part and your colleagues in terms of patient representation to do this work, but it'd be interesting to know whether you feel it would be worth other ePAGs such as, my group, offering to get involved in work that's already underway. What would you suggest?
I think there are, am I still on? Yeah, I think there are two things I would say to that. The first is that by all means, and I'll go through and try and improve it a little, by all means, subject to agreement with Inez et al., that by all means share the template on best practice with your coordinator and with people in your ERN, and just say, by all means tell them that ERN Eye did this. This is how it was approached by them. Is this something we're thinking of? I think one of my concerns is that it's all too easy within all of the ERNs, and even within ours, which I think is getting a lot better now. It's all too easy for things to be happening and people not to be knowing about it. And somehow or other, we have to try and help the networks to overcome that. Sometimes it's not deliberately keeping people in the dark. It's just people leading busy lives that think they've told everyone that needs to know, but actually haven't. To give an example on a completely different thing, we had a meeting on registries at the beginning of January in Dublin. We had a discussion on the forthcoming EJP call a fortnight later, and we were talking about the impact of registries on this particular bid that we were discussing, and the leader of the bid was saying, well, yes, but we've not done any work. We've been talking about registries for 2 years now, and we've not done anything. Obviously completely unaware of the fact that this meeting had been held, totally unaware of the outcomes of the meeting, and nobody had told him, and yet he really needed to know. So they're not talking to each other very often as well. They're not talking to the ePAGs as often, although I think as the result of this workshop and some other things, I feel now fully involved and included, but it's taken me a long time to get there. I hope that Charissa and Ilaria and Alan will confirm that they're getting to the same sort of position in theirs. It's going to be different for every single network. It's going to be a hard slog in some cases. And at one point, I even actually told them I would walk out unless I was given more involvement, because I went through a period where I knew there were things going on and had no clue what was going on. And under those circumstances, you feel, what's the point? Well, the point is that eventually this is going to lead to huge advances, I believe, for all of us.
Russell, you were mentioning that when you were in that workshop, your role was more like kind of mediating when there was not an understanding, and saying, okay, I see it this way or that way. Can you put a practical example so that Alison can understand exactly what type of conversation you were having?
Because I think one of the other things is that if you find that they are having these conversations and want to do it, then how do you get involved? How do you get them to take you seriously? And I think to some extent, the paper that was published actually refers to the value of the patient involvement in the workshop, which was something that I made sure that they put in. Can I think of an exact example? We had a few occasions, I can't remember which particular conditions, where there was a polarization within the committee of 7 clinicians talking about a disease, where 3 of them thought one thing and 4 of them thought the other, and they were discussing it for some length, and finally turned to me and said, well, what do you think? And they actually listened to what I had to say from observing their disagreements, and my view was based on, at the end of the day, how is this going to affect patient care and the way that patients are treated as a result of these definitions? And it's surprising how that's not automatic. You would think that's always in their minds when they look at this sort of issue. But actually, I can assure you, it's not. It's actually rarely in their minds because it's not the way of thinking that they have. And these are patient-centric people. These are not uncaring clinicians, but it's not the way they've been trained, and it's not the way that they've carried on their work throughout their careers in general. This is a new way of working.
But how sorry to follow up, just how a disease is coded, how that can affect the way care is delivered? Well,
when you have a difference in opinion about what, it's not how it's called. The term is likely to be the same. It's the definition or the description of that terminology that is in contention, and people want to describe it different ways. Well, how does it make a difference? It's, you know, in a way, simplistically, I would say, sitting there as a patient, for me, what you're saying in your argument actually isn't really of any relevance to anything that I can see as a patient as to how that's going to I wish I'd recorded it actually, because it's really difficult to articulate. But there were a number of cases where it started to get into a technical, intellectual discussion of something that at the end is all about how do we treat patients better. Treat as in apply treatments rather than be nice to them.
Mm. I see. Yep.
Sorry if that's a
No, I know. I mean, on Monday we had these discussions, for instance, about how to code undiagnosed patients, and it was a massive discussion around that. It's not clear what undiagnosed is. So, yeah. I mean, and it gets very philosophical. It's true. Okay. Anyone else wants to ask a question?
This is Lisa. Sorry, I have to leave shortly, but I want to thank you very much, Russell, for this, because it also shows that when we sit down, we are actually getting somewhere now, I think, both as a group, but also in the way of doing things. And I would like to encourage everybody to move on what you said on salespeople, because I think we're also salespeople within the group, within each ERN. And I do think I always ask for like 15-20 minutes if there is a face-to-face or something. And then, you know, we should start with doing, you know, a short resume of what the patients are involved in other ones, because it shows how active we are, not only in ours. So I think we really have to grab more time to talk about our involvement, because that has to be sold also, even within the organization, but of course also nationally. So it goes both ways or always. So thank you very much. So sorry I have to leave.
Thanks, Lisa. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah. So if there's no more questions, I will.
And you will share the recording as well, right?
Yes. So yeah, maybe I get some feedback from you right now, because we have 5 minutes left. Would you would you suggest that we repeat we have another one in April, so I will be launching a call for, you know, to submit new practices now later this month, and those good practices will be for the April call and then also for Bucharest. Would you suggest to have a webinar rather than a Zoom call? Or do you prefer the Zoom format? Those of you who have experienced both things. I mean, the thing is that for the next one, we might want to reach out to more people so that others can join.
I definitely think it would be good to have other people involved as well, rather than this relatively small group. But if that means that it has to be a webinar, then I think that's the consequence. But I think it's good for others to hear.
Okay.
That's my opinion, but I don't know what the others feel. But
thanks, Simone.
I think the Zoom the Zoom format gives us more chance to interact, and we see each other easier. If you in a webinar, it's usually only via chat or I don't know which format you're taking, and it's a little bit more difficult to interact, and people will be it's easier just to put your video out and start cleaning the house or doing other work at the same time.
Lenya, do we have a limit of people for the Zoom calls, not the webinars?
Yes.
How many?
I don't know. I have to check.
You have to check that. Okay.
Yeah, I think I don't know. I have to check.
But if you can check that.
I think 100.
Yeah, the Zoom we have for Lupus Europe is 100 people, so that gives us still a bit of
100. Yeah, that's what I thought as well, but I'm not sure.
But that should be probably enough then.
Yeah.
I think it's enough. The only caution I would suggest is that it can be quite difficult sometimes to maintain discipline with lots of people with open mics, despite asking them to close their mics, and so you can get a lot of background noise and interference and feedback. And
but can't the organizer mute everybody?
Yes.
Lenya, can you mute everyone if you want now?
On the Zoom. Yes, I think so. Yes.
I would think so. So that should be okay then.
Yes.
Yeah, in that case, I'm certainly in favor of this. I like the Zoom. I think.
Yeah, if it's up to 100, then I think it should be fine.
Great. And I also agree we should try and spread this to as wide an audience as possible. There's a lot of people that can benefit from this information, and we want to share. We want